Welcome back, everybody. So this video will be part 3 of lecture 2, and lecture 2 is Adam Smith, right? So we're talking about Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in the first lecture, video lecture. The first part of this video lecture series of video lectures. We talked about economic growth in Smith's Wealth of Nations. In part 2 of this lecture video series, we talked about exchange values and use values and sort of Smith's approach to the concept of value in general. And in this third video, we're going to talk about the idea of an absolute measure of value. Now, I'm going to assume in this video that you've either seen the previous videos or have some understanding of the fundamentals of Smith's Wealth of Nations. So if you need to, if you're watching this ahead of those, you may want to go back and watch those videos. All right, so that caveat, let's hop right in. So, in modern economics, primarily in macroeconomics, although the idea has applications in microeconomics as well, we refer to economic data as either being nominal or real. So you'll hear economists speak about nominal GDP versus real GDP, or nominal wages. Usually we don't say nominal. People just say wages, right? And then they mean nominal. And you'll hear somebody say, oh, well, what about real wages? Okay. And we do that for many different variables across in the economy. And the very short explanation of that adjustment is that we are adjusting for inflation, right? Which is it's a good explanation because most people can understand that inflation obviously is going to eat into revealed economic values that changes over time aren't going to be very accurate if they don't somehow adjust for general changes in prices. So it's a good explanation because it allows people to understand what we're trying to do. But as economists, it doesn't really tell us much how we do that, right? Oh, we adjusted for inflation. How did you adjust for inflation? And it also isn't really very clear, really why did you do that, right? I mean, it's clear sort of in a general sense why you need to do that, but in a deeper sense, it really isn't there. Of course, what we're trying to do with adjustments for inflation when creating real economic variables is we're trying to understand in material terms, that is in terms of stuff and our ability to make stuff, how much more can we do today versus in the past, right? We're trying to build a gauge or a measure of changes in our material standard of living. And it turns out that that's a complicated problem. And it's not a new problem, right? It's not a new problem. So Smith, as in this lecture, we're going to talk about Smith's explanation of this problem and his proposed solution. And then we're going to develop a little model along those lines and talk about that a little bit. Okay? So when we're really thinking about material standard of living, it's very hard to really pin that down. And I'm not talking about this in sort of a deep philosophical sense as in, are we really better off? Weren't we all better off when we were, living in the woods or whatever because we were at one with our environment? No, that's not this discussion, right? I don't mean to invalidate that discussion, but that's not what we're doing here. Okay. What we're trying to do here is to come up with some clear yardstick to measure whether we're doing better. And that's a difficult proposition. Right now, I'm speaking to you in recorded video utilizing technology that didn't even exist 5 years ago. So how do I compare my ability to use this technology today with the state of my material being 5 years ago? How much better off am I as a result of this technology? And when I buy a computer that costs, maybe 25% more than it cost 5 years ago, how do I capture the betterness of this computer in terms of what it can do into my measurement? It's not an easy proposition. Right? When we think about most commodities that we even serve, some services, but certainly a lot of goods, cars today are very different than they were 10 years ago. How do we compare the betterness, right? So if we say like, oh, cars are 20% more expensive in nominal terms today than they were 10 years ago. Well, yeah, but they're also safer, more fuel efficient, generally have more features, and so on and so forth. So how do we make that adjustment to compare a car 10 years from now, a car today, to get an accurate measure of how much better off we are? Okay. Now, by now, I can see you're probably grasping the scope of the problem here. It's actually worse than that. Well, I shouldn't say worse, right? But it's maybe more complicated than that. I have a couple cartoons here in the next slide. So as I'm talking, you can kind of look at those. And plus, the PowerPoints is available in a separate document for your use, right, on Canvas. If I give you a call right now, like I give you a call on my phone, right, and I ask you, where are you? And you say, I'm right here. And I say, well, where is here? And you answer, well, it's here. Don't you know anything, Kemp? Here is here, right? There's no useful information conveyed in that conversation. Because I don't know where here is. You know where here is, but I don't. It's not a common frame of reference, right? To convey information about, in this case, relative geography, we need to have a common frame of reference. If we don't, we're not saying anything. So here's a picture of the university, right? So, I might give you a call, right? And I say, well, where are you? And you say, okay, I'm at the university, right? Let's just say Schneider Hall to keep it simple, right? Now, you and I know where Schneider Hall is, and we know where the university is. And now we have useful information. In other words, if we have a common frame of reference, we now have the capacity to create an objective measure of geography, and we have also an objective that is across both of us, ability to measure where you are in space, right? You say, I'm 20 feet outside of Schneider Hall to the east. Okay, now I know exactly where you are. But that's not universal. If your grandmother gives you a call, says, where are you? You say, 20 feet east of Schneider Hall. She probably doesn't know where Schneider Hall is. Right? So, she doesn't know where you are, right? That data you've just provided her has no meaning, right? No meaning. But if you tell your grandma, I'm at the university. Okay, probably she knows where you're going to school. And now you've conveyed useful information about where you are, right? Because there's a common frame of reference. Okay. And that common frame of reference doesn't move, which brings us to the last tricky part of this. For our objective standard of value, or our common frame of reference, to have any real meaning, it can't move around over time. So, for example, if Schneider Hall had feet on it and could move around, imagine that. Okay, you tell me like, okay, I'm 20 feet to the east of Schneider Hall. My next question is going to be, well, where's Schneider Hall today? Right? Okay, so if the things we're using as a standard is also moving, it's no longer useful, right? And so it is with our problem of an objective standard of value. We need to figure out something that isn't moving, or if it is moving, generate some kind of countervailing force that makes it not moving over time. And on top of that, that thing, whatever we've chosen, must be understandable as a reference point to everybody who wishes to utilize it. So it's a complicated problem. Okay. Now, I started off this talking about real and nominal, and it's a measure of inflation. This problem persists in economics, right? And it persists in how we do things like how do we construct our CPI basket. If you remember from year 104, you'll recall that CPI is constructed from a basket of household goods. And of course that basket is a choice. It's a choice that we as economists make. And how do we make those choices? Exactly asking the questions that I've just posed. How do we make something that is moving, unmoving? This is why we use a basket of goods, right? Because we're trying to think of things that people generally always buy. And second, we need something that's understandable to all. Well, again, the idea should be that the basket of goods is something that everybody buys. Now, those are two difficult propositions, and so we do sort of the best we can. What I'd like to do for the remainder of this lecture is to go back and look at what Adam Smith did to attempt to solve this problem, and then to think in the end about how we might work to address these questions. So here's more on, right? So if you're at the university, right? So, okay, yeah, you get it. Okay, so how do we create this consistent measure value? And this picture on the slide leads our discussion. If I were to ask people, right, if I were to go out into the street and ask them about their material standard of living, they're going to tell me about, well, I'm getting paid more, things look pretty good for me, right? They're going to revert right to the nominal, by and large. It's very, very difficult for people to think in real terms. If you dig a little bit, you'll realize that they sort of are thinking in real terms, but that's not the way they generally express it. And it's oftentimes not the way they make those comparisons. So for example, a real condition might be something, well, I'm better off today, I've got a nicer house, driving a reliable car, family's all safe and healthy. Okay, we'll call it good, right? But if a person is just seeing a nominal decrease in their wages, they're far more likely to be unhappy with their situation, I expect, than otherwise. And so again, we often get this sort of reversion to the nominal amongst the general population. But we know that that's not correct, right? That's not correct. If my wages had fallen by 20%, but my general expenditures fallen by 30%, then in real terms, we would say that I'm probably better off. And that's a very sort of weak answer, which is why I say probably. And we'll need to poke into that a little more. So let's go. So Smith understood this problem, as I said, and he comes up with, he fully admits, right, like, hey, like this isn't the best answer, right? He kind of says there's sort of no answer that's wholly correct to this, and in that he's right. There is no true objective measure of value, right? But we can try, right? We can try and maybe get relatively close if we think kind of hard about it. And the solution that he proposes, right? So he actually goes through sort of the normal solutions that a lot of earlier economists spoke of, and people still speak of all the time today, right? So he talks about gold and silver and other precious metals, and illustrates actually why they aren't really very good objective measures of value. Mining processes of gold and silver have changed pretty radically over the last, well, even in Smith's time, they had changed pretty radically, and they've changed quite radically since Smith's time as well. Furthermore, gold, of course, doesn't occur in all geographies, and which creates complications that we can talk about if people are interested in class. And it isn't something we tend to use every day, and it is not generally used by the population as a whole. And so it runs afoul of some problems. But enough about that, right? Smith has this other solution. He says, hey, what about corn? Yeah, corn, that stuff in the picture right over there, right? Okay, so everybody knows what corn is, right? He says, maybe that's the closest thing to an objective standard of value. You may be saying, corn, right? And maybe if Smith had been writing in in Southeast Asia rather than in Scotland, maybe you would have said rice, which kind of gets you where we're going. Okay. So, in the 1770s, in the British Isle, everybody eats corn every year. Here's George W. Bush eating corn. Thought it was a funny picture. I don't know. Second, Smith says people can only eat so much, right? So you got to eat, right? First of all, and if you're in that geography that Smith is writing in, you're eating corn, right? Doesn't matter, you're rich or poor. Maybe your corn takes different forms if you're rich or poor, but it's still corn, okay? And you're going to eat it all the time in one form or another. And you can only eat so much, right? Because once you're full, right? So the quantity demanded of corn is a fairly straight function of population. Okay, so you're always going to eat it, and you're always going to eat so much. All right, so you can see what's going on here is we're trying to pin down, or we're trying to eliminate movements and find things that are unmoving. Okay. Similarly, corn doesn't change much from year to year. So the way corn is produced and delivered to market, now we're going to come back to that in a little while, right? Because some of you are saying, well, we got trucks, and like combines. Yeah, that's right, we do, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But the attributes of corn don't change too much over time. And yeah, I know genetics, right? And genetically modified corn and all that stuff. Yeah, don't wreck my story. Okay. Excusing that, corn today looks more or less like it did, 100 years ago. It tastes more or less like it did 100 years ago, even 200 years ago, or even 300 years ago. I know there's differences, right? But remember, it's relative. I mean, think of how many products look today more or less like looked 300 years ago. Mostly down to foodstuffs. Okay. So it doesn't change much in its attributes, right? So it's not like a car, like comparing a car in 2020 with a car in 1970. They're totally different products, right? They're totally different products. 1970 seems too long ago, even 2000. The car from 20 years ago is really a totally different product than what you're getting today. All right, corn, pretty much exactly the same as 20 years ago. Okay, so again, we're eliminating movements. We're trying to find something that stays the same. Okay, so how does this work? So it's corn. Like, okay, so let's walk me through this, Smith. How does this thing work? All right. So let's consider a wage in a given year. Right? Like year X. And we say, okay, well, what quantity of corn would that wage buy? Right? Does it buy 10 pounds of corn? 20 pounds of corn? Okay. And that number, whatever that is, right? So if we take the wage of, say, unskilled labor in a given year, we say, all right, unskilled labor earned this much nominal value last year. That nominal value, how much corn could it have purchased in the marketplace in terms of pounds of corn or kilograms, whatever, if you want to use metric system, how many kilograms of corn could that nominal wage purchase? And we're going to use that as a basis point of comparison in year X. So that's something that hopefully everybody can understand, right? So going back to our map analogy, that's the you are here thing, right? Okay, you are here. Just, what I put there, right? You are here. Okay. So we're going to compare everything to that time, year X, and the quantity of corn that could have been purchased with a year's wages, nominal wages. And we're going to call that the real standard of living in year X. Okay? Or a basis point for analyzing the real standard living. Let's make sure that I didn't skip. Yeah, I did skip. Okay, right, good. Then let's say at a later time, a similar amount of time and effort buys a defined additional amount of corn, right? So we move. Sure I didn't skip them. Yeah, no, I didn't. Okay. Sorry. Okay, right. Oh, right. Sorry, I forgot how I did this already. Ugh. Okay, so let's say that at a later point in time, right? So the same sort of unskilled worker goes to work for a year and receives a nominal wage. And they could buy a greater quantity of corn in pounds or kilograms. Right? So here's a guy with a giant pile of corn. Okay. Well, that's a real increase in wealth, right? So the worker could choose to either own more corn, well, why you would do so is difficult to say, or they could have worked less to receive the same amount of corn. In either case, the effort exerted for a given amount of material wealth, that ratio has improved. More for less. And so we can start thinking about that idea as the basis for thinking about improvements in real wealth or improvements in the economy in material terms, which of course is what we're concerned with. We're not concerned with the economy in nominal terms. It's, maybe great if you get a really big paycheck, but prices are also really big, then that doesn't really make any difference, right? I mean, I could create a pile of fake money, throw it back there behind me and go swimming in it too, but doesn't really mean anything. Okay. All right. So moving up onwards and upwards, let's build this idea into a model, right? So let's formalize this a little bit. Smith's corn theory of value. Okay, so this is a model house, right? To remind you, I've talked about models in earlier videos, right? Models aren't designed to be realistic. They're designed to provide frameworks for thinking about problems and developing answers, right? And so models are effective to the degree to which the assumptions and structure of the model is pertinent to the problem at hand. Okay, so let's develop a model, right? Let's say that we find in year X, unskilled labor earns 10 money units. I don't care what money unit you want to use, dollars, yen, what, bread, bucks, whatever, Bitcoin, doesn't matter. And let us say that those units buy 50 pounds of corn. Then let us say, so again, formalize, right? We can write the numbers out. We can produce specific answers. Let us further say that 20 years later, on that same unskilled labor. Now you might be saying, well, wait a second, maybe the attributes of labor change. Okay, well, we're going to come back to that in a second too. Okay, so you keep that in your head, right? So let's say that 20 years later, that same unskilled labor still earns 10 money units, but that those 10 money units buy 100 pounds of corn, so twice as much as they did 20 years earlier. Well, if people still eat the same amount of corn, okay, which is why we chose corn, because we believe that's probably true. Okay, if it's not, we have a problem and we need to make adjustments. But if people still eat the same amount of corn, then there's no sort of what we might call demand pull in those prices. Right, so demand remains roughly the same. And if the corn has the same attributes, right, so it looks, tastes the same as it did 20 years ago, then what we have left is productivity. Right? So that's what's left moving. And fortunately, that's exactly what we're trying to figure out, right? That's exactly, so you'll recall from video 1, right? Economic growth in Smith is all about productivity, which arises from the division of labor, right? Okay. So in determining sort of real material standards of living, really what we're trying to uncover is a measure of productivity. All right. And with those numbers that we just constructed in our little model, we can say that productivity has increased 100% or doubled over those 20 years. So in material terms, or in real terms, if you will, we can say that the economy has grown by 100%. In material terms, people are twice as well off as they were 20 years ago. They can either produce the same amount of corn as they did 20 years ago in half the time, or the same amount of corn, in the same amount of time, produce twice the corn. Okay, so we have a measure against which to look at material conditions of life across a wide spectrum of time. And so we can compare, we could go backwards too, right? We could say, well, 20 years before that, 20 years before X, how much time and effort had to go into producing 50 pounds of corn, right? Or how long did I have to work to earn the money units necessary to produce 50 pounds of corn? Or if I worked for a year, how many pounds of corn could I buy? How much less was it than 50 pounds? And so across that broad time period, all around common reference point of X, we have a frame of reference that is unmoving, and so we can, or relatively unmoving, okay? And so we have a fairly good measure of improvements to the standard of living over significant periods of time. Okay. So going back to corn, what was it that made corn a relatively good choice? It's not glamorous. It's not something that we celebrate by and large. But it's something that maybe we all depend upon, something that we all need, something that we all utilize in relatively fixed quantities, and it's something that doesn't change very much. And that in the general is the basis for how we want to start thinking about objective measures of value, whether we're thinking in Smithian terms or we're thinking about the construction of real indices in modern economics. What types of things does everybody use? What types of things can everybody understand? What do they use in relative fixed quantities? And what types of goods and services have attributes that are relatively unchanging? And if there are changes to any of these, do we have an ability to create a counter-adjustment mechanism? In other words, if we know that an apple gets 10% better every year, this is a dumb example, right? We know that it gets 10% better every year, then we can make a mathematical adjustment to cause it to not be moving, right? And when we look at a CPI basket, or a PPI basket for that matter too, right? That becomes the question in the construction of that basket, is how do we create this objective standard of value? Because without that, those changes year to year, month to month, decade to decade, they really don't have much meaning, because we're not referencing it to something that we can all understand. We are effectively saying, where are you? I'm here. Where were you yesterday? I was there. Where are you the day before that? Oh, over there. Has no meaning at all. Even if you say, well, here is not there. Here is different from there. Not effective communication. In order to communicate, we need that common frame of reference. We need something that's unmoving, and we need something that everybody can grab onto. Okay, so conclusion. What are the strengths and weaknesses of this approach of Smith? Well, I think we have some basis for talking about that. I would like you to continue that conversation in your own work, right, in your own responses. What adjustments might you make to this model? What adjustments might you make to how we construct modern CPI? I would encourage you to look it up. You can find all the information of how the CPI index is constructed, or PPI indices are constructed, online, right? In the case of the former, I'd be pretty surprised if you couldn't find it at the BEA. You should be able to find both of them at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Okay. The Fed would probably have information on the CPI too. Okay. So, okay, sorry. So, think about that. Think about that. And I think it's important that we keep those limitations of what we can do in our understanding at all time. Because, of course, when we construct real values or changes in real values, it's important to understand that it is a construction. Those aren't like measuring 6 apples or 12 grapefruit or 24 cars. They're constructions, right? Based upon what I think most people would reasonably describe as pretty sound methods, right? But of course, if we aren't able to convey how those constructions occur as professionals, then the public certainly has a right to doubt the veracity of our claims, right? Whether we're right or not. And so it becomes important to be mindful about the limitations of your processes as well as the specifics of your processes as an economist, as really any professional, but this is a perfect example of it as an economist. And Smith's model really provides a nice little easy door into thinking about this. Right? Let's think about corn. Right? It's one simple commodity. And we'll have many examples of this type of work throughout the term in this class. And this is really what this is really what the parts of this class that I enjoy teaching. I hope you found this discussion to be interesting, and hopefully we'll see you again soon for the fourth part, which I think will probably be the final part with Smith. We'll see how it goes. Kind of, I like Smith, right? So maybe I'll do 5. I don't know. All right. See you next time. Take care.